6:05. So we're going to kick off today. Just a note, we will be recording the presentation, but as I mentioned earlier, we're not able to see any of you, so it's only the presentation which will be recorded so that we can share it for future outreach events. So thanks very much once again for taking your time to join us. My name is Nadia. I'm counsel and project leader here at Trisector Associates. And today we're going to try and keep to about a 1-hour session and be done around 7 p.m. so that we can have this chat about how each of us can leverage our professional experience to do good. So if I can just walk you through the brief agenda of what we'll be going through today. Essentially, first, we'll start off by giving you a brief introduction to ourselves and also some of the projects and the work that we're currently doing. Moving on, we'll do a short discussion on how you can each leverage your unique experiences to do good. And we'll pepper that with some personal sharings by some of my colleagues and I here, so that, maybe hopefully our personal journeys can be useful to you in your own journeys. And we'll wrap up in a breakout room. So we'll have a couple of breakout rooms where you can ask us any questions that you like. And in these breakout rooms, just to note that if you choose to stay, we'll be pretty much in like a Zoom meeting together. So we will be able to see you, and we hope you do stay on and switch on your videos so that we can get to know you. Okay, so if I move on to the next slide, maybe what I'll do is hand over to the first person you see on the slide, Kevin. He's our founder. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia, for the kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us. What I'd like to do is to keep tonight quite real and authentic. So why don't I start by just sharing how I came about to do this and how Trisector's journey started. So, growing up in Singapore, I think you see that we've managed to get a certain way of solving social problems for the last 50 years that's really effective. And that is basically getting government to solve problems. And my heroes growing up were people like Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who were public entrepreneurs who set up the architecture for that today. But I think as we go into the next 50 years, there's a real question of, is that way of solving problems really going to be enough? And if not, what's next? So I think it was that question that drove me to go abroad to do my master's degree at the Harvard Kennedy School at the time. And that's when I got exposed to a whole range of different tools that were coming up in all around the world, where actually they tried to get the other sectors of society as well to solve problems together. And I thought, look, maybe there's an opportunity there, not really to copy what was being done abroad, but to take those tools and modify them in a way that would really suit our context and build on the kind of comparative advantages that we've gotten over these last 50 years. So at the time, I was also considering whether to join consulting, whether to join government, or to join this firm called Third Sector that had seen these tools being done in the UK at the time and was trying to adapt it to the US. And I thought, look, if people with the kind of training and exposure that I've been very privileged to receive can't contribute back and don't contribute back, then, who will, right? So that's what made me decide to join Third Sector. I was there launching what are called Pay for Success projects, which I'll explain in a second, and did two, one in homelessness and one in recidivism. But I always thought, how do we bring this idea back home? So about 3+ years ago now, we managed to get the support of, at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister, Tharman, who then introduced us to EDB and local philanthropists to start us off as a nonprofit here. And we still share knowledge with my old firm back in the US, but we're very much trying to understand how can we take all these different models and make it right for Singapore as well as this Asian region. Since then, I'm just really humbled by the kind of people who've joined us on this journey, starting with people, if you got one slide, starting with the team first, folks like Sakai, who joined us from Dalberg, one of the top strategy consulting firms in the world in impact, Nadia here, who is a former lawyer and an MP on the side. We have folks with PhDs from Harvard, Stan, who is a social entrepreneur, and so on and so forth. So, I've always believed that really difficult problems and complex problems require the best people. And so what we are hoping to do is to get professionals who are at the top of their game to solve these really complex problems with us. And that's extended as well to our leadership. So if you look at the next slide, which has the folks who are backing us, we see that these are people who are pretty serious people from all the different sectors of society, including people who are bankers, people who are from the civil service, people who run hedge funds, from academia and so on. So I think of it a bit as sort of the Captain Planet, of social impact. We're trying to get all the powers combined from the different sectors to solve what I think is a real systems level problem. And in particular, we have grand plans to basically help get the different sectors together to solve problems. But we want to do so also in a very concrete way. So our first set of plans have focused on solving the transmission mechanism of funding as well as data, which I'll share in a second. So if you go to the next slide. So let me give you an example. Right now in Singapore, I think we face a number of pretty complex social problems. These include things like drug offender recidivism, where about a quarter of people go back after they come out of jail. Sorry, thanks for letting me know about the sound. The mental health issue, where about 3/4 of people don't actually seek treatment. Diabetes, where about it costs us about $1 billion a year, and persons with disabilities employment, where the unemployment rate is about 5 times higher if you're disabled or not. So these are all issues that I think government has solved at some level on its own, but actually more could be done if we could get the other pieces in place. And we really need more innovation and more solutions in this space. But there's a systems issue. So if you look at the private sector, for example, how does the private sector get innovation? If you go to the next slide. You guys will have all read the news about Grab and going for a SPAC and all these venture capital funds. All of the tools that we're all using today in the COVID-19 situation have all gone through a pretty similar innovation process. And that begins with having not just money, but also the right kind of support at different stages. This includes things like having an angel funder start you off with a prototype to seed the idea, then having venture capitalists help you build the idea, and then finally having the IPOs or SPACs help you mainstream the idea. And actually in the for-profit sector, we've done pretty well in Singapore at encouraging the innovation by encouraging the venture capital ecosystem. Next slide. So, what about in Singapore, right? Why can't we just do more philanthropic funding, for example? The answer is that if you just zoom out and you look at the ratio of spending of different sectors, government is still the biggest player by far. For example, in Singapore, in healthcare, government spends about 30 times what philanthropists spend. So if you go to the next slide, how could we replicate the same sort of innovation system that the private sector has to encourage this kind of social innovation? And traditionally, there has been money, there have been philanthropic grants, and there has also been government funding. But what hasn't really taken place is there isn't really this sort of hands-on building funding. And that's starting to change. Many of you would have seen Singapore just launched the carbon exchange. There's a global trend where because of wealthy millennials and the change in priorities of wealthy individuals, where people are willing to not just make money anymore, but also do good. And by capitalizing on this trend, we're able to replicate this kind of venture funding for the social impact world. But to do that, you need to be able to use a new model, because how can you, for example, invest in a nonprofit? And that's what this pay for success model does, which I'll share next. So in this pay for success model, which is what we're trying to introduce around the region, it has three main steps. And I highlight this because it tries to encapsulate what we're trying to do in terms of getting each sector to play to its strengths. So starting with the upfront funders, these are usually private impact investors and venture philanthropists. They provide the equivalent of venture capital to the social service providers. These can be nonprofits or social enterprises. The service providers then get to try new and innovative things that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to try. And not just that, they tweak the program along the way to be successful, using all kinds of building support. And then finally, and this is the twist, we actually go to the government and we get them to repay the initial funders based on whether or not these outcomes are achieved and based on the value of those outcomes. And the win for everybody is that from the government side, you should actually be able to save money based on all the downstream things that are avoided. From the private funder side, you get to recycle the money to have more impact. And on the social service provider side, you get to really build your capabilities and try new things. Next slide. So I'll just share some quick examples of our work before I hand this over. So we've actually just launched the first Pay for Success model in the region. This is in Hong Kong. I think traditionally, and to my point about adaptation earlier, traditionally people have seen these Pay for Success models in the West as sort of a way to solve budget deficits. And I think in Singapore, as well as in Hong Kong, that's not been the main problem, right, until recently. So really the main issue that we're trying to solve with this is the innovation issue. And how do we repurpose these models to solve innovation? So in Hong Kong, the problem over there is that ethnic minority children, Indians and Pakistanis in particular, don't understand some of the local languages when they go to school. And what that leads to is that they end up not doing badly in school and also not being socially integrated, which leads to poor life outcomes. So we worked over there with Oxfam and the Hong Kong Council of Social Services to scale up a pilot that they had by about 10 times and evolve the model. And in doing so, we helped the government here price out the different sorts of benefits that would result, and they would be willing to pay, in this case, about 5 million Sing dollars based on its social benefits. And our role is sort of in the middleman, having the what I often think of as CrossFit for the mind, talking to the different stakeholders to translate between them and make this kind of thing happen. So this was the first one in Hong Kong and in Greater China, we believe, and we're trying to bring that model here. But beyond that, we're also looking at a few different things. So just last month, we launched the first recyclable grant fund in Singapore. So the problem here is that a lot of small charities are heavily hit by COVID. And while you could just give them a grant, that won't go very far. So what we've done here is we've created a recyclable philanthropic fund, a $2 million fund, together with Maybank and the Majority Trust, where the charities will get that kind of unrestricted operating capital to transform the operations together with our help. And if they succeed in doing so, they'll actually replenish the fund, not to take it back by the funders, but to pay it forward so that we can help more and more charities over time. And that way, that small amount of philanthropic funding, which I alluded to earlier, can be used to solve a much greater series of problems. The last one I'll share with you is something that is about to be launched. So we just started working with the YMCA here on what's called a social impact guarantee. So you know how oftentimes when we go to buy something that's really innovative and we're not really sure, one way people convince us is by saying, hey, look, why don't you get a money back guarantee if it doesn't work? And so that's exactly what we're doing in this case, where we're letting the YMCA try something really new and saying whoever donates to it gets a money back guarantee. And that way, the YMCA is able to try something really new, focus on outcomes. The donors are able to try and give to something that's very different. And from the guarantor's perspective, they're able to recycle their money and put it to maybe guarantee multiple programs at the same time. So, I think between these three things, while each of these is sort of first of your kind, I'll say that all of them are still just scratching the surface, and none of them would have been possible without combining really very high-level skill sets of consulting, investment banking, legal skills, policy skills, and so on. So it's only with those skills combined that we're able to create these types of macro level systems issues, systems change, which helps the underlying nonprofits innovate in the way that we need. So we're currently working in not just these issues, but across a whole range of different issue areas. And I'd love to hear more from you afterwards in the breakout rooms. So let me hand this over to my colleague, Nadia, to share a bit more about the firm. Yep.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for sharing that. I also just want to bring everyone's attention to the Q&A portion of the chat. And if you have any preliminary questions from what Kevin was sharing earlier, please feel free to drop your questions in there so that we can address them together. So I now just want to move on to the next part of our presentation. And really, this is the discussion on how we can leverage our unique professional experiences to do good. And also, my colleagues will be taking the time to share their own personal journeys. So we move on to the next slide. You know, in this chat, we're very fortunate to have so many of you who've signed up, and I think there's a range of participants. Firstly, we've got professionals, some of whom have a few years of experience and you come from various sectors. Some of you come from professional services sectors, you may already be a consultant, or you may be a banker or a lawyer. We also have those from social sectors. You may work with nonprofits, whether local or international. And we also have some of you from the public sector, so you've chosen to join civil service as a start. And maybe for some of you, you may be interested in doing good, you may be interested in transitioning to more social impact work, but you're not sure, are your skills relevant? How can you best leverage your skills? Or really, how do you go about taking the next step? And I just want to caveat here that I'll also be sharing later on about how some of these roles you may be able to achieve some social impact work as a volunteer, but today some of the main examples we'll be giving is moving on as a career. So we also have a number of fresh grads or graduating IHL students. To those of you who are just done with uni, congratulations. I know it can be a little bit of a stressful time or a difficult time, but what we hope to do is to give you a little bit of insight as well. And so some of the key questions that we will be addressing are the following. Really a summary of some of the opportunities out there. And what is the opportunity considered viable given your experience? So, and the last would be just to give you a sense of what is the day-to-day like and how that would look like. So moving on, maybe just to give you an idea of roles along the spectrum. So I think first, as we've mentioned earlier, there's really government. So that would be on a more broad-based macro level sort of impact. And for example, a government agency may review findings of new feasibility studies, new landscape reviews, and you may revise a certain government policy like ComCare, which is our financial assistance scheme, to serve certain underserved populations in chronic poverty. Or you may join a research institution and really do advocacy-based impact. For example, where you may review existing interventions and you may collate best practices, publish this in journals, which may also involve some direct contact with beneficiaries, like through focus group discussions. Or you may be from the nonprofit sector, where you have a lot of direct beneficiary impact. And I think when we talk about social impact, a lot of us start from this perspective, how much do you go down to the ground and how much do you have direct beneficiary impact? And in this case, you would be administering and on some of the social work sort of level to really, deliver whatever intervention to the beneficiaries or to your clients. There's also the funder perspective. So these could be some of the foundations, for example. So other than government giving out grants, there's also several foundations who support the ecosystem. And this is an impact which goes beyond the nonprofit organizations. And how this tends to work is the funders would release a grant call and select a nonprofit to fund for a certain program. and you may do a little bit of the evaluation of the program at the end. Of course, there's also corporates. I think we've come quite a long way since just talking about CSR. But this would mostly be organization level impact, focusing on the specific organization, where, for example, a global MNC may undertake certain initiatives to better align their commercial business objectives with social causes. So, for example, a sustainable supply chain. And then we have consultancies, which is where we come in, and we're really thinking about systems level impact. And as a consultancy, what we do is we identify systems gaps in existing parts of the landscape. So using the same chronic poverty example, we design a solution and we develop the key partnerships to try and tackle this. And that's really, I guess, where our name comes in as Tri-Sector Associates. We work with all different parts of this ecosystem in order to try and generate the social impact. So I'll talk about two things. I guess first, one of the ways to do good is certainly to volunteer, and the other is, and that's the path that I took for several years. And the other part of this would be moving on from volunteering, making social impact as a career. So for myself, I studied in Singapore, and after graduating from law school, I did the good Asian thing and continued as a lawyer. So I took the bar. And I worked in the law firm, private practice, corporate M&A for about 2 years. And then I had the opportunity to pursue my childhood dream, which was in journalism. So I actually joined Channel News Asia, which is our national broadcast media, for a period of about 1.5 years. And I was able to work on current affairs issues because I'd always been very involved in volunteering and social impact. And it was something that I wanted to do. So I thought that media at the time would be able to lend my voice as part of the fourth estate and to influence public thought on social issues. But then I really missed working in the law firm. You might say I had Stockholm syndrome. So I moved back to the law firm for about another 5 years. And then after 5 years, I think I really reached a point in my career and also hit my 30s, which I think for some people, you understand the mini crisis that goes through your head. And I thought, well, I'm not sure I want to spend most of my day doing something when, and then volunteering on boards and things like that in the evenings wasn't going to be enough for a career for myself over the next few years. And I wanted to better align with the social and community work that I was doing. So then I decided to make the jump, and I think it was a big worry for me coming from the legal industry. Am I relevant? What skills do I have? How can I really contribute to social impact and developing, helping Tri-Sector grow as an organization as well? But thankfully, I met Kevin. He can be very convincing. And I think what I'll do is I'll pause here and hand over to my colleague Stan, who will share a little bit about his journey as an associate, as well as talk through some of the skills that we look out for in Tri-Sector. So Stan, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia. So hi, everyone. I'm Stan, and I'm the associate here at the organization. And I guess what I'd like to talk to you about today is kind of what are the key skills that you'll be able to develop in a role, such as in a position at Tri-Sector Associates or within a consultancy and within social impact. And I think before I get into the exact skills, I'd like to provide you a little bit of context so you know where I'm coming from. So I guess for me, my background was that essentially I had exposure to charitable work from a young age with my family. I started a social enterprise out of high school. And then I basically realized that I needed new skill sets and context in order to take my career to the next level. So then I went to business school. And at the end of the business school, I guess, like most of you, or at the end of some part of your career, you're faced with a juncture where you essentially have kind of two decisions. One, you could start your own venture or continue building the venture that you've been building. Or the second one, to work for someone else. And for me, this was a very pivotal point because I knew that I always wanted to build something of my own. But I guess there were kind of three, but I also had this opportunity at Tri-Sector Associates after speaking to Kevin. So the question is, why did I take this opportunity? And for me, it was part of a long-term vision. It's not that I wouldn't build something of my own. It's that I would work at Trisector first and then build something of my own kind of much later in my life. And the three reasons I decided on this are, I guess the first is that Trisector Associates really tackled a systems level issue that I had experienced in my life that I thought was really relevant for all the charitable work and enterprise work. So what I mean by that is, and the core issue here that I'm speaking of is that nonprofits and other social organizations, I believe, are not getting paid their value, but rather the cost of their product. So for example, as a nonprofit, it's not you aren't being paid based on how much social value that that you're delivering, but rather how much it costs to run a program. And that's very different and very unfair, especially you'd understand this, especially if you're coming from a business background, right? No one ever asks you to pay for the cost of goods. They ask you to pay for the finished product. And the second reason for me was that it was really an opportunity to grow. For me, it was like almost going to like a master's school. I looked across the team and the board, and I saw people with expertise outside of my realm and people with far more experience that I get to work closely with. And for example, Kevin went to policy school, specialized in this kind of innovative finance model design. Sakai comes from a development consulting background. Nadia comes from a law background. And on top of that, even some of the members on our board, as you've seen, are really some of the most influential people in Singapore. And what other opportunity can you have that really provides you kind of exposure and training from all these kinds of people? And finally, back to the venture building point, it's that I really saw this as an opportunity to venture build kind of on someone else's dime, right? Because we all know that building a venture is risky and sometimes the failure rates can be high. So the question is, so I saw this as really an opportunity to work with some of the best people to kind of learn to build a venture right. And in a way, I think about it as kind of venture building school, except I get paid to do it. And some of the things that you get to do, that I've been able to do in an organization like this is really about one, building the board connections that I talked about, learning about the fundraising, resource allocation, having key internal processes like hiring, et cetera, et cetera. Well, long story short, I've been here in Trisector Associates for 2 years now. And so I think I have a sense of kind of the skill sets that I think we need to be able to succeed in a role like this. And some of these skills you'll have, and some of these skills you get to develop, right? Because not everyone comes with everything. That's just about your willingness to learn and having kind of a good foundation. So I guess with that, let me delve a little bit back into the slides. So I guess first and foremost, I think what I've seen through my time here is clear and structured written communications is really important. And the reason for this is we're working across sectors and we're working with people that are either at the heads of organizations or even people at the bottom of the organization. And we need to be able to kind of write clear points to them and be able to communicate our intent and what we're trying to do. So I think communication is a key skill that you'll need to succeed in consultancy. The second is about analytical skills, being able to really think about the problem, to really identify a root cause. Because I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is design projects for systems level change, to change things for kind of good, right? And so we really have to think hard about what are the key problems that we're trying to solve and what are the solutions that we're proposing. The third skill is about research skills. A lot of times there's no perfect information out there. But the question is, can we identify proxies quickly so that we can know what answers are right and what answers are clearly wrong? Fourth is around stakeholder management. As I mentioned, we're working with people kind of across different levels. So we have to be able to empathize with them. We have to be able to be sensitive to their needs, but also manage them in a professional manner, so that the expectations are right. The fifth point here is around resource management, which is really around effective planning and time management. So for a lot of these projects that you're creating, that we're running as an organization, and for those of you using consultancies, you'll know that essentially your time is the cost to your company. So it's really about how do we effectively plan and scope projects, and how do we manage our own time so that we can achieve the KPIs within the resources that we have. And the next point here is around being an independent solver. So I think a lot of time, the problems that you'll see as you're developing projects like this really rely heavily on the context of the project. So there may be like 20 different conversations that you've been having, or conversations you've been having over years, right, about how to solve a certain problem. And all of these have to be kind of considered when you're proposing the solution and when you're trying to figure out what's the best way to solve the problem. And so being able to really think deeply and being able to be resourceful in reaching out to your personal networks and just being really creative about how you solve a problem is really important. I think finally, last but not least, for sure, is really having a passion for systems level impact. And I guess when you're going into a role like this, projects can be aggravating. They can take a long time to launch. There can be multiple deaths of a project and moments that you have to revive a project. And so there are ups and downs, and you have to be quite clear in terms of why do you want to do this, and is this really something and is the end goal really something that's valuable to you? Do you really want to see this impact that exists? Do you really want to make this impact across this ecosystem? So I'll stop there. You'll be able to speak to me later on in the breakout rooms if you wish. But for now, let me please introduce you to my colleague, Sakai, who will talk through some of the slides.
Thanks a lot, Stan. Could we? Yeah, okay, great. So maybe I'll just share a bit about my own background. So as Kevin mentioned, I joined from Dalberg, which was a strategy consulting firm that worked in the social impact space, to move on to another consultancy, Trisector Associates. And there's often a question of, why did you move from one consulting firm to another, which is not very common. So what's special about Trisector for me was that at Trisector, I was able to do things that was slightly different from what I was able to do previously. So the first was end-to-end ownership. So normally in a strategy consulting firm, what usually happens is you finish a consulting project and then you hand it off to the client for them to implement. In this case, at Trisector, we are often the anchor of the project, and we are often taking the lead in driving it forward and getting it to launch. I think this is a key difference. The second was the development of skill sets that was able to help us create and launch some of these projects. I think at a strategy consulting firm, a lot of my focus was just on analyzing the problem and breaking it down and doing the research, doing the analysis that's required to get to the answer. However, often that answer might not feature about the who and the how of doing it or implementing the solution. I think at Trisector, I was able to do this quite a lot because as the drivers of the project, we also need to figure out who else out there would be willing to partner with us. Why should they be partnering us, and how can we convince them to work with us? And other consultancies is back then when I was at Dalberg, we often kind of look around for best practices in the industry. For example, doing a lot of industry benchmarking and learning about case studies from one another. But I think at Trisector, what's different is we are working at the kind of the forefront of social innovation and trying to think of new models that no one else has thought about to solve the needs of our clients. And this is slightly different because what we're trying to do here is really create new models that no one has seen before. And you can't really copy paste any of this or benchmark any of this. So I think these are kind of the three reasons why Trisector is, again, just quite different from traditional consultancies. Let me move on to share more about the job openings at Trisector. Yeah. So we have two roles that we've opened up. One is the project lead role, which is what Nadia and I our positions are, and then the second role is the analyst and associate role. So I think the difference between both of these roles is this number of years of experience. More information can be found on our website. Later on, if you do have specific questions about the opportunities, feel free to ask them. Yeah. So often one of the questions that I get when we talk to candidates is, what kind of training does Trisector provide for people who just graduating from school or transiting into the sector. Because I think for a lot of you, your own training is really important, and there's this perspective that perhaps working in the social sector, you don't really get the kind of top tier training that you usually get, let's say working in the commercial. I think at Trisector, we really focus heavily on changing that mindset by having training as a core priority first. So how we do that is in 3 different ways. There's a lot of intensive training opportunities for you. So when you first join the firm, you'll go through onboarding training for 10 to 12 weeks. That's one way of getting training. The second is more often than not, on the first day, you already be staffed on 1 or 2 projects where you get access to, you get exposed to your client needs, get to interview and meet and engage different stakeholders. And lastly, every week we also sit together for a weekly training. And this training really focuses on building your own professional skills such that, and some of this training do not actually typically happen on the project level. For example, Kevin may sit down with us to discuss, how can we better do, how can we do our negotiations better? How can we help improve the financial modeling skills that we already have? So I think there's a lot of different training opportunities that you will get. And this is true, I think, at our levels. The second is, the second thing that in terms of training is you also get to access materials and intellectual property from other partners that work with us. So we are partners with, for example, the South Sea Hawk School of Public Health, and also other investment banks where, anyone who joins can get access to such materials. And the last thing that we believe is really important is for individuals to own their own professional development. So at Trisector, you get autonomy in deciding what kind of training you want to get. So for each of us, we get allocated a professional development budget, which you can then use to then pursue courses that we are most interested in pursuing to develop our own skills. So I'd say these are kind of different ways we get training. And I do think compared to the previous firm that I was in, I'd say this is a lot more intensive and a lot more intentional. Thank you. Move on. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that to round it up, I joined Kevin roughly 2 years, 4 months ago, and it's been quite a journey for myself. Many things have happened since then. I've been working on this Hong Kong project since that day, and when I finally had a chance to launch it, I think we all kind of were really relieved. But I think more importantly, having been one of the first few employees at the firm and having journeyed through this years, I think what was really great was that I had the opportunity to work with many different people who join us, and I think what's really important for me is who I work with on a day-to-day basis, and really looking forward to seeing, people applying to us and being interested in this role, because I think not at many places, you don't really get the opportunity to work with people who are really focused on impact and more specifically on the systems level impact like Trisector. Yeah. So with that, I'll hand back to Nadia to do the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Stan, for sharing earlier, and Sakai as well. We do have some questions that were sent through in the chat and in the Q&A, so I'll let Kevin answer some of them, but maybe I could start off by answering one of the questions, which is a day-to-day work. Maybe it sounds cliche, but really I think no 2 days are the same. We have several phases that we run PFS projects, and it could be anything from the research phase, and you might be doing feasibility studies or running focus group discussions with social workers, or conducting desktop landscape interviews with different social service agencies. Or you could actually be sitting down to really try and brainstorm what sort of intervention would be new, would be something that's helpful to the ecosystem. Moving on from that, you could also be doing advocacy to certain government agencies, or you could be trying to do fundraising, and there's a whole spectrum. Clients tend to engage us for different parts of the spectrum or the whole spectrum. And I think every day is pretty dynamic. I think like Sukai was sharing, there's a lot to learn from everybody in the team. So I would say no 2 days really look the same. And I think in order to get a PFS to launch, so that's definitely a significant part of the work. But as I mentioned, we do work along the different phases. So you could be doing impact and evaluation monitoring, or you could be doing research. And then you just do whatever it takes in order to try and launch the project. I will be handing the time over to Kevin, if that's okay, to answer some of the questions that we have. Mindful of time, so we'll try and keep this to about the next 5 to 10 minutes. Then we'll also be breaking into the breakout rooms. So for those of you who want to ask other personal questions, please feel free to stay on. Kev?
Sure, thanks, Nadia. I'm just looking through the questions and seeing which ones I should answer. For the parts about challenging parts of the job and so on, perhaps you can ask some hard questions to the team shortly in the breakout rooms. Perhaps I'll answer the more general questions on the SIG, for example. So the social impact guarantee, which will be the first in the world, works as follows. So basically, we get a donor to, in this case, give the money to the Y, and then we have a third-party guarantor who says, okay, if we don't achieve certain stretch outcomes, we're willing to give the donor the money back. And in this case, the donor will actually probably not take the money back, but try again, or try with a different program achieving the same outcomes. The guarantors in the short run are people who are savvy philanthropists or impact investors. But in the long run, we hope to bring in the vast balance sheets of the insurance companies who, to this day, have not really been connected to the social impact world. To give you a sense of scale, earlier I shared the total amount of funding by sector. All philanthropic funding is about $2 billion. All government social spending is about $32 billion in Singapore. Private wealth held in Singapore is about $4 trillion. So quite a multiple, and the insurance assets are even more significant. So that's really a huge scope for us to crowd in new ways for people to work together. For projects, let me answer in this case the question about projects that we've rolled out in terms of scoping and implementation. I'd say the biggest problem is a mindset problem. I'd say, it's already hard to make a change when things are obviously broken and you need to fix them. But perhaps it's even harder to make a change when things are doing well and you're trying to make it even better, right? Because people don't see necessarily the need to innovate until it's kind of too late. And many of these long burn things, many of these systems level things are much more abstract. It's much easier to volunteer and clean the beach than it is to say, okay, let's change the funding structures for the NGOs to clean the beach, right? But that kind of work is as important because without that kind of systems level work, you're always sort of picking away at the problem on the ground. So a lot of what our work is, apart from the execution side of things, is I think quite thoughtful, which is, really if we were to start from a blank piece of paper, what is the role of the different sectors and how should they solve problems? So that's, I think, some of the issues that we face. And then, downstream, there are the usual technical issues, trying to get everybody to agree and so on. But those are things that I think as the team grows and as we have such competent people, I think, we basically add a lot of value to try and solve them. Perhaps let me just answer one last question here, which is the company's near future plans for expansion, project-wise, in terms of human capital. You know, I think we are at a pretty interesting stage in our growth. When I first came home, it was me in a Starbucks. And now I think, and you know, people were wondering whether or not these projects would even, should even exist in this part of the world. And now we're at a point where we've piloted these first things around here. And we're at a point where we want to go both broad and deep. Broad because we want to spread our work to the surrounding region and also expand it to new issue areas. And go deep because I think that while we have piloted these these tools here, you know, our goal is not just to start something here that looks like what's been done in the West, but to make something new that actually nobody else there has done either, and maybe they'll copy us in future. So I think there's still a lot of new developments and new tools that we're trying to create and improving the existing tools that we've got. So in terms of human capital, that basically means that we're looking for people to join us with diverse skill sets, but a common mission. So let me just end here because I think it's probably best that we do the breakout and you know, you can ask some harder questions. But my email address, I'll just leave it in the Q&A later, or we can send it out also to everyone who attends. And you can feel free to ask me any other questions that I didn't manage to answer today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for answering some of those key questions. And thank you everyone for submitting your questions as well. I do think we will be moving on to the breakout room portion of things. So if I can just trouble my colleague Safri to put it in the chat. I'll just pause a moment to ensure everyone can see. So it's in the chat now, and we do hope that you stay on so that we get the opportunity to meet you in the breakout rooms. If you would like to join us in the breakout rooms, you'll need to click through that Zoom room in order to be funneled into the breakout rooms.